I'm going to change. So we are going to, okay. So welcome, good morning. We know it's early for many of us, and afternoon for others. Welcome to the side event on women, motherhood, and substance use. We're very pleased to have an excellent panel here. And this will be available on social media after this, since we know that many people would be unable to connect because of the time. We have interpretation. So at the bottom, you will be able to click on the map, and from there you can choose whether you want to have interpretation off or whether you want English or Spanish. So it will be the final two presentations will be in Spanish. So if you need interpretation for those, you can just click on that, or you can be listening from now in Spanish. So feel free to use that so that you can understand everything that's going on as well. And you can turn it on and off as you need it. We also have Jorge here who's helping with technical anything. So thank you to Jorge and Javier for helping us on this in this side event. I just wanted to give a very brief introduction. I'll be briefer today, which is that we decided to do this side event because it's part of a series of side events that Acción Técnica Social and Instituto RIA have been doing over the last 5 years at the CND, beginning with topics such as drug checking, cocaine regulation, peace building and social justice. Last year was adult drug use, responsible adult drug use, and this year really approaching the topics around women and mothering and substance use. And so we choose to bring these topics to a space that often does not hear either about lived experience or what's going on the ground, which is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And we also seek to bring topics that can help to break the taboo. And so that is the goal with the conversation that we're going to have today. And we look forward to having this conversation and that it can be a dialogue, although we will obviously be having presentations from individuals. Around this topic of, well, and just being a mother, maybe that this has become closer to home now with 2 children. I left one sleeping in bed, so we'll see how she does now. It feels like on an international level, we take tiny steps, but what we really need is a very large paradigm shift that would guarantee how we take away a punitive, stigmatizing, and criminalizing approach to women, mothers, people who are currently pregnant or gestating, and substance use, any substance use. There's obviously a lot more openness to substances that are legal. You know, your doctor will even tell you, you can have a glass of wine, but we don't talk about anything else. And so our goal here is to have a conversation about what do we know, what do we not know, and how do we begin to propose policy solutions around that, whether at an international level or at a local or national level. You know, there's tiny things, you know, where the WHO came out and said CBD does not, has been shown to have no negative impacts, but more research is needed. These are the tiny steps I'm talking about. Whereas then we see these horrifying moments where children are taken away from their parents or from their mothers for these issues. And that's what we want to get at today, kind of put in the balance how harmful this can be to families and communities and individuals. So I'm very excited today. I'm just going to present our 4 speakers, and then we'll let them begin to speak without me presenting them between each speaker. So first we're going to have Lynn Paltrow, who's the Executive Director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women, which is one of the main organizations, and really, although it's a national organization, there are very few other organizations in the world that are doing this work around pregnancy and really how do we support pregnant people during this time and the relationship with substance use. We also have Dina Ortiz, who is a harm reductionist and part of the leadership team of the Urban Survivors Union, and somebody who we've seen speak and are very inspired by. I mean, the thing is, we also can make these side events and we just invite people who we want to hear speak, and we want to hear their voices in these spaces. We have Vanessa Morris, who's the coordinator of Échale Cabeza, which provides information and drug checking in Colombia. And she's the author of numerous publications, including Women and Parties. And they recently undertook a survey on women and drug use in Colombia, and she'll be sharing some of that data. And obviously, Échale Cabeza is a project of Acción Técnica Social, who we're very pleased to co-host this with. And then we'll hear from Nuria Calzada, who's a member of Mujeres Canábicas in Spain, who's also a state level coordinator of energy control and a board member of LEAP Europe and Instituto RIA, and obviously also an advisor of Acción Técnica Social. So we have a panel of incredible, inspiring women. So I'm very excited to have you all here. And I'm just going to pass the microphone, the proverbial microphone, to Lynn Paltrow right now. Lynn, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really, I'm honored to be here. And in my short time, I just want to start by pointing out that this side event, this opportunity takes place in a world in which the female prison population continues to rise dramatically. From 2000 to 2017, the overall prison population increased by 20%, but the number of women and girls by 50%. And that is so despite the Bangkok rules in 2010 that set standards designed to limit unnecessary imprisonment with particular attention to addressing the specific needs of women. And this isn't because women have become more engaging and become more like criminals, increasing criminality, but political choices, particularly harsh drug policies that continue around the world. Drug policies and sentencing fail to take into account the vast majority of imprisoned women are mothers and the particular circumstances that led them to use drugs and be engaged in drug trade. One thing very early in my talk, I just want to say, with a disproportionate number of foreign nationals among the female prison population, countries had moved toward considering and should allow transfer of those female prisoners, those mothers, to serve their sentences in their home countries, near their children and near their families. I'm going to focus particularly in the United States, where drug control provides the cover for attacks on the human rights of women and all pregnant people. And I want to acknowledge that people of all genders can become pregnant. And so I'll be using the terms pregnant women and pregnant people interchangeably. My organization did a study of arrests that would not have happened but for pregnancy. And we looked particularly first between 1973 and 2005 and identified 413 cases in which, but for pregnancy, a woman would not have been arrested or subjected to some other kind of significant state control. We found that the primary targets for testing, arresting, and separating families are low-income women. 59%, a huge disproportionate number of women were women of color, and again, hugely disproportionate, 52% were Black. How did these arrests come about? Frighteningly, many of them come about as a result of disclosures of private medical information by state authorities, to state authorities, by healthcare workers and helping professionals, social workers, and others, which gives a beginning idea of the loss of human rights, including confidentiality, medical decision-making, and undermines the trust between patients and their providers. What we also learned from this research is that 84% of the cases that we were able to identify involved an allegation of pregnancy in either drug or alcohol use. We are also in the process of looking at documenting arrests since 2005. And significantly, we've discovered that there have been 1,300 arrests. So almost 3 times as many arrests in half as many years. And again, it appears that the vast majority of these arrests are justified by drug control policies, justified by stigma relating to pregnancy and drug use. So what are some examples of that? In Oklahoma, I should just explain that as a matter of biology, 15 to 25% of all pregnancies end in miscarriages and stillbirths. That is just biology. But if there is a pregnancy loss and a positive drug test, the assumption is, the scientifically unfounded assumption is that the person's drug use caused the pregnancy loss. In the state of Oklahoma in the United States, Brittany Pula, a 19-year-old, experienced a miscarriage between 15 and 17 weeks. It was blamed on her use of methamphetamine. She was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to more than 4 years in jail. This is so despite the fact that the medical community increasingly in Oklahoma and across the country has consistently said that the use of criminal and other punitive responses is inappropriate. And despite the fact that we know that methamphetamine does not cause miscarriages or stillbirths, that it doesn't even have a pathway to do so. I like to point out that if any of the criminalized drugs worldwide were good at causing pregnancy loss, many more women, especially those in countries that ban abortion, would be using them. But they do not cause pregnancy loss, even though they become the excuse to arrest as murderers people who experience miscarriages and stillbirths. In Oklahoma, those arrests also are being made now for women who test positive for marijuana, a drug that, again, has nothing to do with pregnancy losses and does not, no studies have found a causal connection between marijuana and any harmful impact. Not that the use of criminal law in response to pregnancy would ever be justified, but when it's justified by junk science and medical misinformation, it is all the more reason to challenge those arrests and the underlying misinformation. In Alabama, there have been more than 500 arrests. The majority involve allegations of pregnancy and marijuana use, including marijuana use by women like Katie Darovitz, who has epilepsy. The medication for epilepsy is known to cause birth defects. She switched to marijuana because it was effective in controlling her severe epilepsy. And yet she was then arrested and charged with a crime for doing what was actually safer for her future child than using the prescription medications. The stigma associated with drug use, the stigma that's supposed to be challenged, as a result of UNGAS and other discussions addressing the harms of punitive responses to drugs, the stigma continues to be so great that this woman in Alabama who had a prescription, an appropriate valid prescription for pain medication. She had a severe back injury. She tried not to use her opioid-based pain medication. She had to near the very end of her pregnancy, and she was arrested for illegal possession of a drug, with the claim being made that she somehow hoodwinked her doctor into continuing her pain medication by not disclosing her pregnancy. That wasn't true, and it is not fraud to be pregnant and use valid medications that you need to control excruciating pain. In Mississippi and numerous other states, people have been arrested as child abusers for testing positive for marijuana. In this case, she was charged with a crime for having marijuana in her system. No evidence of harm, just inner system. And I often bring my urine sample to me where I speak and say, in the United States, this urine cup, which can tell you perhaps if it's accurate, whether or not I've used a particular drug within a particular time, cannot tell you if I am dependent on that drug, if I am a good parent or a bad parent, if I make my children my priority, or anything about the health of my children. And yet a urine cup, a urine test in the United States, and perhaps around the world, has been used as a basis for determining parenting ability, for separating families, and for arresting people who have just gone through the risk to their own lives and health of being pregnant and giving birth. The Movement for Family Power in the United States has come out with this report. Not only is it the drug war and punitive drug control policies play out in the criminal law system through law enforcement, but also through child welfare, the family separation system in the United States, where again, a positive drug test can determine whether or not you are allowed to parent and can keep the child you love with you. Many families have been separated and subjected to intrusive, traumatizing, dangerous separations that you will be hearing about more from people who've experienced it. In one of our cases in Arizona, the state of Arizona, Lindsay R., let me go back and say we've made progress. It's some progress in the United States, particularly around discriminalization of marijuana. Majority of states have legalized medical marijuana, and there's been some decarceration generally, but not for pregnant women and around medical marijuana for pregnant women. So it is pregnancy that becomes the mechanism for reinforcing punitive, irrational drug laws. In Lindsay R.'s case, she had a number of serious health problems. She was the beneficiary of medical marijuana. She was a certified medical marijuana user. When she gave birth in Arizona, they applied a law that says a single positive drug test, no evidence of harm needed, is civil child abuse. And she found herself put on the state's child abuse registry, which will keep her from all of the kinds of employment that she had previously had and that she could use to support her family. She used the marijuana effectively to address a condition during pregnancy called hyperemesis gravidarum, which is extreme severe morning sickness, what's called morning sickness, through the entire pregnancy that can result in death and neurological harm to the developing baby. Her marijuana use, in fact, was protective both of herself and her baby, and yet she has to fight charges of being labeled forever, or for 25 years at least, as a child abuser. These cases all occur in spite of numerous medical groups saying that all of these punitive approaches are counterproductive. And in spite of the evidence that none of the drugs show a causal connection to any harm, with this new study, a systematic review of prenatal exposure to cannabis in particular does not find any conclusions regarding cognitive impairments. We asked that the CND follow the recommendations that were made for UNGOS 2016. And as Zara said, things move slowly. This Women's Declaration insists, and we insist, on ending the unjust injustice perpetuated by global drug prohibition, which should be replaced by public health approaches. Otherwise, we see what's happening in the United States, in which not only does the drug war continue, but it becomes the front for depriving people of fundamental human rights around pregnancy, and all of its outcomes, whether it's giving birth to a healthy baby, experiencing a pregnancy loss, or having an abortion. I'm now, thank you for this opportunity. I'm now going to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Dinah Ortiz.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much. I learn something new every time I hear you speak. And the fact is that you come with the facts and you come, with the science. And what I have learned throughout my years of representing parents is that the majority of times that their children are removed, it's due to drug use. Even if there are no, there's no abuse or neglect tied to their parenting, they still will remove a child due to drug use. If the parent is not ready to attend a program, which we know all programs are basically 12-step, kind of like abstinent-based programs. And if the parent is not ready, they are like, well, you're choosing the drug over the parent, over your child. And so that was frustrating to me. And I always, found myself like, arguing with the worker from the child regulation system, because it's like, this is not a one size fit all, and if they are dropping their child off at the babysitter, or if they are having, getting respite for their child, if they are doing what they need to do and their child is healthy and their child is not abused, why can't they do what they need to do until they're ready to stop? Right? Because that's really what people want. Everybody, wants people to stop using drugs. And I assume that it was the same way during Prohibition with alcohol. You had to stop using alcohol. But look where we're at right now. And I just don't think that we should be expecting people to stop using drugs. If that is something that they choose to do and they're not harming anyone, they're not, harming their children, then I think that they should be able to do it, right? Like we were talking earlier about, people drinking alcohol. People, even doctors say, you can have a glass of wine. They don't say you can have, a bag of heroin. You can do a line of cocaine, even though that doesn't do any damage to the child. But the minute that they hear of heroin, cocaine, crack, or anything that is the illicit hardcore drugs, and I put quotes around it, because those are not the worst things for a fetus. It's actually nicotine and alcohol that are the worst for a fetus, and those are legal. The minute that they hear about the hardcore drugs, then it's, well, we got to call ACS or, the child regulation system. We have to report this. You're doing damage to your child. If you're not ready to stop, if you're not ready to go into a program, then you need to, then we're going to put your child in foster care. Even though all these psychologists that came out to defend, like not, when everything was going on at the border with the children being taken from their parents, all of the psychologists said that it does more harm to remove a child from their parent, regardless of the situation, than to keep them at home and nurture and help the family, right? They're not saying that the same things about the child regulation system and the people that are removing children right here in our own backyards. And it applies equally, whether it be for a day, whether it be for 6 months. If you remove that child from the only environment that they've known and they are comfortable and they feel safe there, you are doing more harm than good. And then you're dragging the parent out through the extent, through the extents of the case. Basically, the parent has to show up to court at whatever, 9 o'clock. They always tell them show up at court at 9 o'clock in the morning. They won't call the case till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Sometimes, people don't have money to go for transportation. They don't have money to eat. So they're in court all day long with no food. They don't have a babysitter, so they have to bring their kids, or if not, their kids are in foster care. And it may be a day where they miss a visit because they have to be in court. Like, so many things come into play when we have affluent parents that are using drugs in the comfort of their own home and their children are not being removed. And so what I am for is dismantling these systems, right? These systems, these structural systems of oppression that are basically saying we need to teach you how to parent your child. I parented my children for years during my active drug use, even through my chaotic drug use, right? I parented them for years, and my kids will tell you, my mom did the best that she could, even while she was using drugs. And most of the time we didn't even know, like, that's what my kids will say. And yeah, I'm not saying that I was the perfect parent during that time, but I also didn't have support, right? If you have a support network and you have people, like they say, it takes a village to raise a child. If you have a support network that you can reach out to, it can go so much better. And we can stop thinking about, like, we don't ask diabetics, when are you going to stop, taking insulin? We don't ask people with cancer, when are you going to stop taking your cancer medication? We only do that to people who use drugs. When are you going to stop using your, medication assisted treatment, or when are you going to stop using drugs? And it's stigma surrounding, drug use. And it basically is around Black and brown people and indigenous folks. It does not pertain to affluent people. White people blog about using drugs, and you don't see the child regulation system getting involved in their lives. My case lasted 7 years, and it was because I kept going back and forth. Like they would produce 3 warrants. They would tell me, we have 3 warrants, you have to produce your kids. And I would fly from New York to Florida and take my kids to Florida. And then they would have to transfer the case to Florida. I'm like, you're not putting my kids in foster care. Like I have family, I will leave them with my family, but you are not putting them in foster care so they can be more harmed in foster care, which is all about money. It's all about, well, let's get these, kids, let's get them diagnosed with something, so that way, they can be in therapeutic homes. And then there's more money involved in that. Like, it's just a money train. And it really is, like, it is a foster care to prison to homelessness. And I don't want to say pipeline, and I don't want to, because I don't want to insult my Native American friends, but like pathway, basically. It is the pathway from just foster care to prison to homelessness. There's no in between. You've never heard of a real successful story of a child that spent their, most of their years, their childhood years in foster care. In fact, I've represented clients that were young, that had children that were still in foster care, and their child, because they were in foster care, their child would in turn be removed from them because they were in foster care. So there's no good ending to this. What I propose is that we dismantle, because there's no retraining. There is no, we can make the system better. No, let's dismantle this system that we do not need. Let's stop the surveillance on poor people, and let's do it another way. Thank you so much. And I will go ahead and pass it along to my fellow colleague that is going to speak next.
Thank you so much, Dinah. Vanessa?
Hola, buenos días, muchas gracias
Buenos días.
por el espacio. Bueno, yo les quiero contar un poco de nuestra experiencia frente al tema de mujeres y drogas. El año pasado iniciamos nuestra primera encuesta para conocer cuáles eran las dinámicas de consumo en contextos de fiesta y otros aspectos relacionados con un enfoque de género. Hicimos una encuesta, les voy a compartir.
This is just a reminder that if you need interpretation, you can feel free to go to the bottom where there's a map, and you can click on it, and it will help you to get the Spanish to English interpretation. And let us know if you have any problems in the chat.
De la encuesta respondieron 3.526 mujeres, de las cuales 3.058 viven en Colombia y 468 en otros países. Usualmente respondieron de México, Chile, Argentina y Perú. La mayoría de las personas que viven en Colombia, las mujeres que respondieron, viven en Bogotá, seguido de Medellín y seguido de Cali. Aproximadamente la mitad de las mujeres encuestadas cuentan con un nivel de educación superior, educación profesional, perdón, el 21% educación media secundaria y el 14% con técnico. Y el 3% especialización. En cuanto a la identidad de género, El 95% de las mujeres se identificaron con identidad de género, mujeres cisgénero. El 2 prefirió no hablar de su identidad, seguido del 50, perdón, seguido del 0,78 mujeres no binarias y el 0,43 mujeres trans, y solo un 0,29% indicaron que eran de género fluido. Frente a la vivienda y la familia, el 57% de las mujeres encuestadas indicó vivir con su familia, el 17% con su pareja, el 15% vive sola, el 9% vive con roommates. En cuanto a hijos biológicos, solo el 7,22% de las encuestadas dijo tener hijos biológicos. La mayoría de las mujeres que respondieron a la encuesta pertenecen a los rangos de edad de los 18 a los 24 con un 51% y de los 25 a los 30 años con un 34%. Frente al consumo de sustancias, quisimos indagar pues, cuáles eran las sustancias que habían consumido pues, a lo largo de su vida, tanto legales e ilegales. En las sustancias legales pues, aparece el alcohol como prevalencia, el 98%, seguido del tabaco con un 78%, seguido con los vaporizadores o cigarrillos electrónicos, 62%, sedantes 27%, inhalantes 7% y antidepresivos el 0,7%. Frente a las sustancias ilegales, el cannabis tiene mayor prevalencia con un 96%, seguido el MDMA con un 77%, seguido el LSD, después el popper, el tusi, que es una preparación pues muy colombiana en este momento, pues ha tenido como mucho auge, es una preparación de MDMA, cafeína, ketamina y un colorante, digamos, usualmente rosado, lo que conocemos como el tusi criollo colombiano. Luego la cocaína, luego los hongos y la ketamina, entre otras sustancias. Siguiendo con el consumo de spa, cuando indagamos sobre los consumos en los últimos 3 meses, el cannabis tiene una mayor prevalencia con un 82%, seguido del MDMA con un 51%, seguido del LSD con 34%, seguido del popper 26%, el tusi nuevamente 23% y la cocaína 16%. Aquí en este aspecto quisimos indagar como cuáles eran las prácticas de reducción de riesgos y daños que las mujeres implementaban en sus consumos. Queríamos saber si analizaban sustancias antes de consumirlas, si mezclaban con otras sustancias o si compartían también parafernalia. Frente a los análisis de sustancias nos dijeron que no analizaban, la mayoría, el 69%. Las mezclas, en su mayoría las mujeres sí mezclan sustancias, entre sustancias el 69% respondió que sí. Y si compartía parafernalia, el 70% respondió que sí. Digamos que esto pues, son algunos riesgos multidimensionales en cuanto a las dinámicas de uso y consumo de las mujeres usuarias. Muchas de ellas dicen que no analizan porque no conocen el servicio del proyecto, pero lo que hemos, digamos, podido ver en nuestras intervenciones en cambio es que las mujeres delegan mucho esta función, como en sus parejas, en sus amigos. Todavía hay mucho miedo y mucho tabú de poder analizar tu propia sustancia. Continuando también con el consumo de spa, quisimos pues saber como cuáles eran las principales motivaciones de que las mujeres consumieran sustancias. Y tenemos que sentir placer, es digamos como que el mayor porcentaje, 68,90%. Luego del ocio, 68,38%. Luego aparece potencializar las experiencias o las emociones con un 58%. También la socialización con un 48%, la introspección con un 43%, las prácticas sexuales un 33%, la funcionalidad un 30%, entre otras. Pues es llamativo que las principales razones por las cuales las mujeres consumen sustancias psicoactivas están relacionadas con el placer y con el ocio. También la mayoría pues, respondió que cumplía funciones en su cotidianidad y un importante porcentaje lo relacionó con las prácticas sexuales. Es que pues esto nos llama mucho la atención. Frente al consumo de sustancias en cuarentena, quisimos saber cuál era como la percepción del consumo durante la pandemia, sobre todo el periodo de aislamiento, si las sustancias le habían ayudado a sobrellevar la pandemia y si había sentido abstinencia. Frente a la percepción del consumo, nos dijeron, un 43% dijo que aumentó su consumo, un 33% dijo que disminuyó y un 23% dijo que se mantuvo igual. Frente a si el consumo le había ayudado, que el consumo de sustancias le había ayudado a sobrellevar la pandemia, el 62% dijo que sí y el 37% dijo que no. Y frente a la pregunta si había sentido abstinencia durante la pandemia, el 48% dijo que no, el 18% dijo que sí y el 33% dijo que a veces sentía abstinencia. La mayoría de las usuarios mencionaron que su consumo aumentó, lo cual pues está contrastado con otros ejercicios investigativos, como fue nuestro informe sobre drogas y cuarentena, donde también pudimos ver que algunos de los consumos pues aumentaron en cuanto a sustancias más como tipo el cannabis, LSD o otras más de introspección, por no decirlo así, mientras que las sustancias de socialización como el éxtasis, la cocaína o el MDMA en cristal, digamos que tendió como a bajar un poco mientras estábamos confinados. Bueno, durante la cuarentena, entonces tenemos que en las sustancias legales, pues hay un consumo de tabaco, 77%, seguido, perdón, un consumo de alcohol, con un 71%, seguido del consumo de tabaco, con un 44%, vaporizadores o cigarrillos electrónicos, un 21%, y sedantes, 10%. Frente a las ilegales, también vemos en la cuarentena, pues una prevalencia del consumo de cannabis, el LSD, el MDMA, el popper, el tusi y los hongos. Bueno, frente al tema de la convivencia y las sustancias psicoactivas, en cuanto a la convivencia en casa, el 82% de las mujeres indicó que su consumo no ha afectado la convivencia en su casa, mientras que el 17% considera que sí. El 82% también de las mujeres establece que en sus hogares no hay nadie que tenga problemas con el consumo, con las sustancias, mientras que el 17% considera que sí, que vive con personas que tienen consumos problemáticos. El 82% de las mujeres respondieron que su consumo no ha afectado la convivencia en, digamos, como donde viven, en su residencia como tal, mientras que el 17% indicó que sí. Frente a la pregunta por el porte de sustancias por solicitud, vemos que un 60% de las mujeres portan sustancias psicoactivas en espacio público por petición de sus parejas o amigos. Esto digamos que nos pone pues en mucho más riesgo con la fuerza pública, pues ya de por sí la policía tiene una actitud hostil y violenta con los consumidores de sustancias, ahora con las mujeres pues es más fuerte. Frente a las mujeres, el 38% de las mujeres dijeron haber sido víctimas de violencias basadas en género por parte de la policía, siendo el acoso verbal con un 37% y el acoso físico, unos 74% las principales razones. Frente al aspecto de la maternidad y sustancias y consumo de sustancias psicoactivas, indagamos acerca de si había consumido sustancias durante su embarazo, y aquí solo nos respondieron 286 mujeres, de las que tienen hijos biológicos, y en los temas de maternidad pues nos dijeron que habían consumido durante el embarazo sustancias legales como el tabaco y el alcohol, y sustancias ilegales como el cannabis, en su mayoría el 64%, seguido de la cocaína, el LSD, el MDMA, popper. En los temas relacionados con la maternidad y el consumo de sustancias psicoactivas, vemos que todas las personas que consumieron algún tipo de sustancia durante el embarazo, sí consumieron sustancias durante el embarazo, pero durante la lactancia no consumieron sustancias ilegales, ni spa legales tampoco. Cuando indagamos acerca del estigma frente al consumo y su embarazo, nos manifestaron que sentían una gran estigmatización frente al consumo relacionada con el embarazo y su maternidad, principalmente desde sus familias y sus parejas. Varias como que manifestaron ataques psicológicos por parte de la familia y ataques psicológicos por parte de su pareja. Adicionalmente, el 8,12% de las encuestadas ha perdido la custodia de sus hijos por consumo. Otro aspecto que tuvimos en cuenta dentro de la encuesta fue el tema de las actividades sexuales pagas. Aquí respondieron 100 mujeres que practicaban actividades sexuales pagas, de las cuales el 70% se dedican a trabajo de webcamer, el otro 60% a venta de contenido erótico, el 18,39% a escort o compañía, el 5,75% trabajo sexual en establecimientos, el 5,75% dominatrix y una solamente por sumisión. El 68% de las mujeres que respondieron que practicaban actividades sexuales pagas dijo usar cannabis para realizar estas actividades, seguido de la cocaína y seguido del tusi. Bueno, por otro lado, frente a las violencias basadas en género, el 60% de las mujeres dijeron haber sido víctimas de violencias basadas en género mientras estaban bajo el efecto de alguna sustancia, siendo el acoso verbal el más común, con 35%, seguido del acoso físico con 34%, la violencia psicológica 15% y la violación 13% y la violencia verbal 13%. Aquí resaltamos que la problemática de las violencias basadas en género a las que se ven expuestas las mujeres en los espacios de fiesta y ocio, el 47% dijo haber sido víctima de acoso verbal en bares y en fiestas, y el 38% haber recibido acoso físico y un 9% violencia verbal. Vemos que esto pues nos llamó mucho la atención también porque pues, nos interesa ver cuáles son estos protocolos de género que se están implementando en los establecimientos y ver que son necesarios totalmente. En este mismo sentido, muchas de las usuarias dijeron que a pesar de haber visto a otra mujer en estado de vulnerabilidad, no la ayudaron por miedo, la gran mayoría, el 59%. Igualmente la indiferencia también es un factor relevante. Pues todavía hay mucha pena, mucha vergüenza frente a cómo actuar en estas situaciones. Por último, y ya manera de conclusiones, pues lo primero que podemos ver es que es posible evidenciar un vacío en la información sobre el uso de sustancias psicoactivas en mujeres en América Latina desde una perspectiva de género. A las mujeres históricamente se nos ha negado el derecho al placer, tanto en el ámbito sexual como en el uso de sustancias psicoactivas. Entonces esto hace que también pues, nos discriminen un poco más como usuarias. Por otro lado, pues a pesar de que existen muchos informes, investigaciones o estudios, estadísticas frente a las consecuencias de la guerra contra las drogas y la consecuencia en las mujeres, como sobre todo los temas del encarcelamiento o el trabajo de mujeres campesinas y cultivadoras, no hay mucha información de las mujeres que consumen drogas en contextos de fiestas o en otros contextos relacionados con esto. Debemos seguir construyendo y profundizando estrategias de reducción de riesgos y daños, sobre todo en el uso de sustancias y las prácticas sexuales. Debemos seguir insistiendo en la necesidad de abrir espacios de participación efectiva en las mujeres que consumen drogas, tanto en el diseño, en la implementación y la evaluación de las políticas de drogas. También debemos seguir generando evidencia científica frente al consumo de sustancias psicoactivas, sus efectos e interacciones en otros aspectos de las mujeres, teniendo en cuenta el uso de anticonceptivos, los tratamientos hormonales, este tipo de cosas. Y hacemos un llamado a las organizaciones feministas de la sociedad civil para que incluyan dentro de sus agendas temas de consumo de spa, creación de alianzas con organizaciones que trabajamos la reducción de riesgos y daños. Y por último, hacemos un llamado a la industria del entretenimiento, tanto a los bares, fiestas y festivales, todos sus promotores y organizadores de fiestas, que incluyan protocolos de género en sus establecimientos. Muchísimas gracias. Le doy la palabra a mi compañera Nuria.
Muchas gracias, Dani.
Hola, ¿sí? ¿Me oyen?
Te oímos y te vemos.
Vamos allá. Bueno, pues muchas gracias por la invitación a participar en esta mesa tan necesaria y un tema que nos preocupa a todas y que está presente a nivel global en todos los países del mundo, ¿no? Hoy hablo en representación de Mujeres Canábicas, que es una iniciativa que nace en marzo del 2016 como el primer proyecto de la Red Estatal de Mujeres Antiprohibicionistas de España. Y obviamente pues la cuestión de la maternidad entendida no solo en el proceso de gestación, sino también el periodo de lactancia y crianza ha sido una de las principales preocupaciones desde el inicio de nuestro colectivo. ¿Qué es lo que ocurre en España? Tenemos una situación en la que las competencias en materia de salud están transferidas a las comunidades, a las diferentes regiones, comunidades autónomas de España, por lo que pues, cada región actúa según sus criterios y también su legislación. E incluso ocurre que a nivel regional no se dispone de ningún protocolo o ningún procedimiento de actuación que esté consensuado y que sea único, por lo que la situación es que cada hospital, cada centro sanitario actúa según su propio protocolo. En cualquier caso, sí que existen puntos de unión y que son comunes, yo creo, a todas las personas que estamos aquí, a todos los países y a todos los centros sanitarios en todo el mundo, que son pues, la asunción de que el consumo de drogas de cualquier sustancia es nocivo para el bebé y que se debe conseguir la abstinencia total. Existen ciertos márgenes de maniobra cuando hablamos de consumo de sustancias legales, a pesar de que los daños están bien descritos en la literatura científica, pero no existe ningún margen de maniobra cuando estamos hablando de sustancias no reguladas, a pesar de que los resultados pues, son contradictorios, poco concluyentes y además los diseños son muy limitados, las muestras no son representativas y existen muchos factores de confusión. Y pasa también que la corrupción no está únicamente en la policía o a nivel gubernamental, sino que en la ciencia también hay bastante corrupción en este sentido, ¿no? En qué es lo que se busca y dónde se focaliza el centro, el foco. Otro punto en común es que se suele considerar que el consumo de cualquier droga ilegal y en cualquier forma es dañina para el feto. No se distinguen entre sustancias ni tampoco entre formas de uso. O sea, es decir, todo está en el mismo saco y se reacciona, se activa el protocolo ante cualquier sospecha o ante cualquier positivo en el consumo. Y yo creo que también destacaría que existe cierta preocupación y una tendencia al alza para detectar de forma precoz estos casos de consumo, pero siempre desde un punto de vista punitivo. En la región de Cataluña, que es en la que yo me encuentro, se rige por una ley del 2010 que habla de los derechos y las oportunidades en la infancia y la adolescencia y que considera el maltrato prenatal como una situación de desamparo. ¿Qué entiende esta ley por maltrato prenatal? Pues cito textualmente: la falta de cuidado del propio cuerpo, consciente o inconsciente, o la ingestión de drogas o sustancias psicotrópicas por parte de la mujer durante el proceso de gestación. Esto se considera maltrato prenatal y por lo tanto es una situación de desamparo de cara a la legislación catalana. ¿Cuáles son las repercusiones más de tipo legal para la madre? Y lo sé también por experiencia personal, porque yo tuve que enfrentarme a este sistema. Pues la detección del consumo activa el circuito de un embarazo de riesgo y existen una serie de controles de orina, tanto durante el embarazo como en el momento de nacer se toman muestras de orina del bebé. Los resultados positivos en estos controles durante el embarazo, pues evidentemente dan lugar a un mayor control y una mayor vigilancia, siempre desde un enfoque punitivo, y también tiene ciertas repercusiones postparte, tanto durante la lactancia, porque se puede tomar la decisión de prohibir la lactancia del bebé, y también pues, el seguimiento por parte de servicios sociales, que siempre pues, es un engorro, ¿no? También. Otros tipos de impactos más de tipo personal que sufre la mujer, pues destaco el impacto que tiene el transformar una experiencia única, irrepetible y maravillosa, como es la del embarazo y también la del parto, en una auténtica pesadilla en ocasiones, ¿no? El peso del estigma y la criminalización de la mujer cae con todo el peso institucional, tanto desde los profesionales sanitarios como desde servicios sociales. Encontramos también a menudo un trato denigrante y condescendiente, pues del tipo no estás capacitada para ser madre o eres una mala madre, una mala influencia para tus hijos. Esto da un resultado muy claro, que es el silencio. El silencio, pues sobre todo porque si se explicita ese consumo se corre el riesgo de actuaciones desproporcionadas y por lo que, aunque no es políticamente correcto, la recomendación que haría a cualquier mujer embarazada es, en caso de consumo, nunca informar a tu médico. Y si él te pregunta, miente. Con lo cual, todo ello da un resultado al final de invisibilidad. No se declara el consumo por estigma y por miedo a las consecuencias, y si no es visible, no existe, y si no existe, no se puede intervenir. Por lo tanto, desde los profesionales y las profesionales sanitarias se pierde la oportunidad de hacer un adecuado acompañamiento y además de conocer más a fondo la cuestión. Se habla mucho del tema del embarazo y el tema de la gestación, pero yo creo que el impacto es también muy grande durante la crianza. Y en ese sentido me gustaría explicar dos ejemplos muy recientes. Yo soy madre de 2 hijos, un niño de 13 años en plena adolescencia y otro niño de 10 años. Mis hijos han crecido viendo la planta del cannabis, tanto aquí en casa como en casa de amigos, pero también viven en una sociedad con un discurso y un paradigma imperante, y han crecido también viendo las noticias donde la policía entra armada a las casas donde hay plantaciones, plantas de cannabis. Y la semana pasada, en una de estas visitas rutinarias en las zonas rurales, ven la policía de tanto en tanto pues, hacer visitas rutinarias de control. Vino la policía en esta visita rutinaria y el susto que se llevaron mis hijos, porque se pensaron que nos íbamos a ir detenidos, que íbamos a tener aquí una operación policial, ¿no? ¿Cuál es el impacto, me pregunto, que esto tiene en mis hijos, en la concepción que tienen de sus papás? ¿Son criminales? ¿Son delincuentes? ¿Va a venir la policía a casa? ¿Nos va a llevar detenidos? O también, por ejemplo, mi hijo de 13 años ha empezado la secundaria y ha recibido su primer taller de prevención de drogas, y claro, cuando le pregunto cuál es el resumen de que te han contado, básicamente es que las drogas son malas. Entonces, si los inputs que reciben tanto la sociedad en general es que las personas que consumen drogas son delincuentes, son enfermas, son malas personas, no están capacitadas, son unas irresponsables. Me pregunto también cuál es el impacto que esto tiene en mis hijos, en la concepción que tienen de sus padres, ¿no? Y también, más allá también de las experiencias personales, y como habéis comentado también, en el caso de la crianza existe también un impacto devastador en los tribunales al utilizar las drogas como arma arrojadiza, pues por ejemplo, entre padres biológicos y padres que quieren quitar la custodia a los padres biológicos, ¿no? Y utilizan este argumento de las drogas para alejar a sus hijos y conseguir ellos la custodia, o más habituales entre padre y madre que están discutiendo la custodia de los hijos en caso de separación. Y todo esto ante la sola sospecha o denuncia sin pruebas, como habéis dicho antes, sin pruebas de abuso, ni de negligencia, ni de desamparo, ya se activan todas las alarmas. Y esto es devastador porque acaba separando familias y bueno, poco que añadir a lo que habéis comentado ya, ¿no? Y todo ello bajo la falsa presunción de que consumir drogas te hace una mala persona, te hace una persona delincuente, un criminal, y que es un peligro tener hijos y hijas a tu cargo, ¿no? Algo que nunca, además, raramente se plantea en el caso del alcohol. Como decía Lynn, un positivo en orina no dice nada ni sobre el tipo de consumo que estoy realizando y mucho menos sobre mi capacidad de ser madre o la responsabilidad con otros temas de la sociedad, ¿no? Con mi trabajo, con la familia o con pagar mis impuestos. En definitiva, me planteo que en este mundo que es prohibicionista y que criminaliza y que estigmatiza a las personas que consumimos drogas, pero especialmente a las madres y a las mujeres, a las madres por el triple, ¿no? El triple estigma de ser persona usuaria, ser mujer y encima madre. Entonces, en este mundo en el que vivimos, resulta lidiar en la educación de mis hijos para que tengan un discurso, una narrativa diferente de drogas, cuando todos los inputs que están recibiendo, es decir, se contraponen con lo que están recibiendo en el núcleo familiar más duro, porque incluso en el núcleo familiar más abierto, los abuelos, los tíos, esa concepción también está presente. No sé cuál puede ser el impacto en la concepción que los hijos tienen de los padres, ¿no? En este sentido. Para acabar, recomendaciones que haríamos desde Mujeres Canábicas, pues respecto a la gestación, poco que decir, más de lo que habéis dicho también, que es el tema de promover la investigación, pero la investigación rigurosa, superando las limitaciones antes comentadas, la participación de colectivos y mujeres usuarias, y en este caso nuestro colectivo ha participado en un estudio sobre maternidad y cannabis en convenio con el Departamento de Salud de la Generalitat de Cataluña, un estudio liderado por el Hospital Clínico de Barcelona, y hemos podido aportar tanto mujeres voluntarias al estudio como participar en el diseño y en el análisis de resultados. Creo que es fundamental la formación de profesionales para mejorar el abordaje desde el punto de vista sanitario a nivel global en el tema de drogas, pero específicamente en el tema que nos ocupa hoy, que es en el tema de las mujeres, un abordaje que sea menos amenazador y que supere sobre todo la barrera del estigma, que es la yo creo que es la barrera más grande de cara a establecer esta relación abierta con los profesionales sanitarios. Por supuesto, revisar los protocolos de prevención, de detección y de seguimiento a nivel médico y social, de manera que se priorice pues, el acompañamiento, la reducción de riesgos y no se priorice la vigilancia, el control desde un punto de vista punitivo. Desde mi punto de vista, desde mi experiencia personal, lo que puedo aportar es que el conocimiento nos hace libres. Mi experiencia personal es que yo, aunque tuve ese positivo y esa activación de los circuitos, el conocimiento afortunadamente me hizo libre. Y cuando pude discutir abiertamente con la ginecóloga que quería pues todas estas cosas, ¿no? De quitarme la lactancia y de tener un seguimiento de servicios sociales, claramente le estuve pidiendo dónde estaban las evidencias de que un consumo ocasional de cannabis durante el embarazo fuera perjudicial. Le invitaba a que me sacara los estudios. En mi caso, afortunadamente tuve un final más o menos feliz, pero no es el caso de muchas chicas que quedan retenidas en los hospitales y quedan pues, bueno, señaladas, ¿no? por la institución. Y respecto a la maternidad, es que yo creo que el cambio es, como ha dicho Zara al inicio de esta charla, se trata de hacer un cambio de paradigma, un cambio global de narrativa, de discursos. Hemos problematizado algo que no era un problema, que era algo normal, el consumo de sustancias que ha estado presente a lo largo de toda la historia, con diferentes usos, y eso lo hemos problematizado. Ahora parece que es un problema cuando hablamos de normalizar el consumo de cara a las instituciones, resulta que es promover. Yo creo que debemos normalizar el consumo, no es una cosa problemática que debamos criminalizar ni perseguir, y por lo tanto también reivindicar el tema de my body, my choice, mi cuerpo, mi elección, tanto para si quiero o no quiero tener un bebé, como qué sustancias quiero tomar a lo largo de mi vida, independientemente de si soy madre o no. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Nuria. Y gracias, Vanessa. Gracias, Dina. Gracias, Lynn. I would want to do a round of conclusions, but I know that there are people that have to go on to other side events that they might have. And so I'm going to conclude. And then if we want to stay for a few minutes just to kind of reintegrate this conversation, I think it would be good. I'm staying with each of phrases that each of you have said, you know, that in many of these cases, they're choosing the parent, or we're choosing the rights of one over another, instead of really thinking about also how the intersection of these rights are very much together. No, that as parents, as women, we are in, if you would, like nuclears that then keep us kind of connected to children, but then to our communities, and that by having the government intervene in this, you're really breaking with that connection that we have as communities. The role of pleasure and human rights, which Vanessa spoke about, that most women, that's why we choose to use substances, and that it's a fully legitimate use, and that it's very, that we don't study it enough. And then I'm stuck with this, that doctors in these cases are not our friends. And that's sad. The health system then is not here to support women as they go through this change in their life, or really at any point, if you've been using any sort of substances. And so that really the message to women is, don't talk to your doctor about what's going on with your life, because that person cannot be trusted. And that's something that we really need to think about in as we think about policy design around this. And then, yeah, how do we come up against what society is holding us to with raising children, when you have tried in your home to maybe have a different perspective and to break those paradigms, or when you've spent your life educating your children in a certain way, but then the system around us takes that away, or confronts that with myths and misinformation and junk science, as Lynn said. And so how do we really begin to use this as a way to, how do we confront this? And I mean, for us, it's about opening this conversation and obviously promoting that there would be more research, that there would be more studies around this topic. But I think we have a long way to go. And I think that the fact that we can have this conversation here also demonstrates a certain level of privilege, that we are able to even have this conversation when we know that so many of our compañeras are not even able to talk about this within their families or within their communities, or they feel tremendous guilt, which when I was speaking with Lynn yesterday, you know, just guilt is kind of something you carry as a woman and as a mother. And so how do we let that go and allow ourselves to really live fully as women, as mothers, and as people who use drugs? So with that, I'm just going to close it. I'm going to say that that's, if anyone needs to leave, they're welcome to. And on the other hand, I'm going to open microphones. So if anyone wants to respond to what was said, if anyone wants to just have a small conversation, please feel free. So that we aren't confined by Zoom. This would be like if we were getting a coffee afterwards and she woke up. And I'm stuck with this, it's just research versus reality, because we're hearing like the law and what is like pushed on us versus then the reality of that we're all okay. I don't know if anyone wants to say anything, or if not, we can go have some coffee.
I mean,
yeah.
I'd love to
Please.
just contribute. I'm so anti punitive measures, right? I think that society is based on punishing people, especially, you know, Black and brown people and indigenous folks. And the way that they do it is by targeting families, and specifically through the child regulation system. So they figure, well, you know, they use drugs, they're Black or they're brown, you know, they're Latinx, they use drugs, they're people of color. So what we're going to do is we're going to target them, and then we'll remove their kids. And then, you know, like it's a ripple effect from there. And so for me, I just really, really feel like, you know, we put so much emphasis, and we kind of use like whatever they say. What I learned when, you know, going to court with our clients, our, you know, parents and stuff, was that the judge would put so much emphasis and so much trust in what these workers were saying about our parents. Meanwhile, we were in the rooms and we were listening to them. They would not listen to our parents. They would not listen to the families. They would not see the pain that the family, that the mother, that the father, you know, felt the minute that they felt like their children were at risk of being removed. And for them, they're like cops for families, you know? So I just feel like they don't need to exist, right? And I said that before. I'm an abolitionist. They do not need to exist. I think that the mass incarceration movement needs to start connecting the dots with the foster care system and the child regulation system, so that we could work together and see that the majority of women that go to jail and go to prison is due to drug use, or taking the rap for their, you know, spouse or their partner for drugs, right? And they're the ones that lose out, because at the end of the day, they're the main caretakers who get, you know, who get wrapped up in this, and their children are the ones that are at risk. So we could avoid all of this. We need to just really just get rid of these systems, get rid of this child regulation system, and start really investing in our mothers, in our families. And we can't separate the mother and the child. You just can't. And that's what they do. That's what these systems do. They try to separate them so that you don't see like you feel like the child can do without their mother, but they cannot. And so we need to start really showing them that you cannot separate them. They are intertwined. And if you're going to do for one, you have to do for the other. And you have to start thinking of them as a family unit.
Definitely. Definitely. I don't know if anyone else, I mean, I think at the half hour we can close. Yeah, please, Lynn, go ahead.
I thought Nuria wanted to say something first. I just wanted to point out that I'm a nerd. I believe in research. I think more information is great, but I just want to say a couple of things that we know and we don't need more research on. We know that punishment doesn't work. We know that criminalization has not stopped, changed drug use, the human need to have experiences that are pleasurable or that relieve pain or that, deal with the issues we deal with. It's just a human thing and no amount of criminalization and no more research is needed. We also know that public health approaches, harm reduction approaches work better than anything else. Year after year at the international harm reduction conferences, somebody else has produced the latest study comparing abstinence only and punitive this with harm reduction, compassionate, respectful approaches. It is always those that work far better than anything punitive. And we also don't know more research to know that none of the criminalized drugs cause any unique or more significant harms than, for example, a lifetime of poverty, lack of nutrition, and the stress that comes, for example, in the United States from constant racism. We don't need any more research on any of those things, and we can address issues of drug control based on those understandings right now today.
Thank you, Lynn. Nuria, do you want to say? No? Okay. Lynn, Dina, Nuria, Vanessa, thank you so much for being here this morning, for waking up very early, for being part of this side event. Hopefully next year we can all be together and we can keep having this conversation because it is clearly an urgent conversation. We know that every day children are being separated from their parents for these reasons. And we know that it's completely unnecessary and that it actively harms all parties involved. And we also know that women oftentimes are utilized to protect other people and other interests, and that our bodies are often not our own. And so I hope that we can, as you say, we don't need more research on a lot of things, but hopefully more of the research that already exists can filter up to the right people so that changes can be made. Thank you very much, all of you, for being part of this. Thank you to the audience, and I hope you have a very good Friday and a very good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
I want to take a picture of all of you, but I need, there we go. That's going to work there. Now I'm going to be able to. And I wanted to say thank you. Oh, I lost Nuria. Ya perdí a Nuria. And thank you, Javier, for everything, for the interpretation, and Jorge.
Yes, and Jorge, let's connect so we can probably have lunch or something.
Bye.
Bye.